Political Innovation, Keaton Mansfield, also in New York. Now, Danny, as you know, U.S. authorities are taking advantage of this pandemic-related health rule called Title 42 health rule, and that was made under former President Donald Trump to expel many of the migrants without offering them, you know, the chance to seek asylum. Is this what Joe Biden had promised to do while he was running in the race for the White House?
Well, I think even beyond the bipartisan issues, whether Biden increases the number of Haitian immigrants and migrants in general who are allowed to come here or doesn't, we have to get in front of this narrative and underneath this narrative that people are just coming here because the United States is so great. What exists here is the relationship between a neo-colonizer and a neo-colony. Many of these Haitians were forced out of Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. They were living in Chile, they were living in Brazil. That situation was no longer tenable. So they continued to travel north, trying to make it to the US and to be met here with insults, racism, humiliation, and even whips from the Border Patrol. The symbolism is huge in terms of how the U.S. ruling class and the U.S. population sees Haiti and Haiti's people. So I think this is an important educational moment so people understand the true relationship that exists between the most powerful imperialist country in the history of humanity and Haiti, which continues to be a neo-colony in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm. Danny, maybe you've seen those pictures of U.S. border guards using, you know, horse reins to control immigrants. Some observers say that those pictures remind them of the violence seen during the slavery times in the U.S. How do you feel when you see such scenes? Is this how the land of opportunity deals with asylum seekers?
Yeah, the land of opportunity in big quotation marks. That's part of this mythology that capitalism and white supremacy tries to spread around the world. Those images of the whips and the patronizing tone of the racist white supremacist tone of those Border Patrol guards also harkens back to the 1915 and 1934 U.S. military occupation of Haiti, when thousands of Marines um, stepped on Haitian dignity and Haitian sovereignty and tracked down the Cacos, the Haitian resistance fighters. The same thing that's happened today in the neo-colony, whether it was under the auspices of the now assassinated Jovenel Moise or under Ariel Henry, the prime minister today. The PHTK, the party in power, continues to repress the Haitian popular movement. So Haitians are asking across the country and across the diaspora, when will we be afforded a chance to survive in our own homeland?
Okay. Now, author and political analyst for the Center for Political Innovation, Keaton Mansfield, is also joining us from New York. Good to have with us, Keaton. So the question I have for you is, there's some people who are blaming the policies of President Biden's for this influx of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border. What factors play a role here?
Well, with the assassination beliefs, you have to look back at what happened in this recent tragedy as the assassin intervention is home, dressed as security guard, they were assassinating the president, and some of them escaped without any of his personal security being killed without fatality. That, of course, two or three of these attacks were from my anti-immigration characters, which in many ways reminds us of the assassination attempt on former President Cuba Fidel Castro, and a hotbed for quote-unquote popular support for U.S. intervention in U.S. regime change. Biden promised to be the president who would end the border crisis, one of the things Trump was constantly attacked for party crisis and handling of immigration. Instead, we see that Biden is supporting just as many, if not more people, than former President Trump did in handling the Haitian immigration crisis. So, refugees coming from Afghanistan as well and all across the world is very telling.
Sorry, I gotta jump in. Keaton, we don't hear you, all right? So let me just go back to Danny and give our technicians a little bit of time to see if they can fix this problem. Daniel, let our viewers hear your opinion on how President Trump's policies could be responsible for this influx of migrants.
And I would go way before President Trump or President Bush or Tweedledee or Tweedledum, two sides of the same coin. This is decades and centuries of unfettered colonialism and neocolonialism practiced on what many have called the U.S.'s backyard, the Caribbean, Central America, the entire hemisphere. The Haitian people want a new way forward. The Haitian leadership has communicated from Port-au-Prince and Ocap Haitien their enthusiasm in seeing the message of Evo Morales going to Cuba and then to Venezuela and CELAC and Nicolas Maduro regrouping in Mexico City, the pivot of Lopez Obrador and the Mexican leadership denouncing the blockade of Cuba. And this is what the Haitian people want. The Haitian people want integration with their peers, south to south development, not development based on the underdevelopment of Haiti. That's how they frame it, the development of underdevelopment. Haiti has incredible potential. It always has. It's been always punished because of its great resources under the subsoil, and of course its number one resource, the Haitian people. So the Haitian people are looking for a way forward based on the unity of oppressed people and the integration that Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and now Bolivia and Peru have spearheaded.
Mm-hmm. Danny, there are also rights groups criticizing the Biden administration. They say that the returns are inhumane, and that's because of the dire security and economic situation in countries like Haiti. Let's have your take on that.
Of course, they're 100% correct. And to hear Alejandro Mayorkas talk about how humane their treatment of Haitians was is ridiculous. It's an entire system predicated on treating other human beings as subhuman. But I think we have to go even deeper than these liberal critiques. And as I was saying, even if the U.S. Biden were to increase the number, the cap to 200,000 new migrants allowed in, really there's 10.5 million Haitians, and if you were to open up the border tomorrow because of these institutional, structural, historical, geopolitical issues, what Haitians would stay home in their homeland? And that same question goes for Dominicans and Mexicans and Salvadorians. When you're talking about so many years of inequality, of exploitation, of the devaluation of a people's currency, of occupation, of sanctions, of invasion, what choice do people have but to flee in pursuit of the stolen resources, the stolen gold, the stolen coffee, the stolen emeralds? So I think this shift in Latin America that's going to play out as we speak at the General Assembly about 100 blocks from me right now, it's going to be very important to see what happens in the next few days. I mean, Latin America and the Caribbean are again on the rise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have Keaton Mansfield back on the phone for us. Keaton, go ahead with your comments. Sorry for that interruption.
Yes, well, that's very true. As I was at the United Nations building earlier today, only an hour ago, you see many different groups coming together in support of fighting back against U.S. imperialism, fighting for the sovereignty of their homeland, for the rights of their own people, against those in power in the U.S. And so Biden is not living up to what he promised to be on the campaign trail, which seems to be a popular tradition for American politicians to make promises that not only do they not follow through with, but in Biden's case, done the exact opposite, ramping up deportations, ramping up police funding, ramping up foreign intervention. It's more than anything, it's scary to see that this is the state of the U.S. political climate and the politicians that are put in place to try to represent or pretend to represent the American people. It's a shame. It's a sham.
Keaton, rights groups argue that Title 42 is not based on science and is actually a violation of U.S.'s own immigration laws, and they're asking the president to reverse that policy. Now, would President Biden take heed of that and reverse the policy?
I find it unlikely. the U.S. constantly violates its own procedures, protocols. It violates UN procedures and international protocols. So the idea that Biden would, unless he's faced with perhaps severe retribution or severe criticism from his own internal party bureaucracy, from Democrats who are in power already, who have sold out to the system, sold out to imperialist practices, it would be very unlikely that Biden would do a 180, so to speak, and suddenly become the president that he pretended he was on the campaign trail.
Okay. Now, Danny, we had White House spokeswoman just recently announcing that the U.S. government has a range of program options and financial support in place that would assist Haitian nationals and authorities without specifying any further. What could those plans be?
Well, at the most, there'll be drops in the ocean, drops in the bucket. These are liberal band-aids that won't change anything fundamentally in Haiti. It's the core group, it's the Organization of American States and the UN acting under the auspices of the U.S. Embassy that have the final say in all things Haitian. This is an issue about Haitian self-determination. Colonialism and the neo-colonialism has always been a one-armed bandit extracting from Haiti. So for Jen Psaki or any representative of the Biden government or any U.S. government to try to project this benevolence towards Haiti is extremely hypocritical. The true benevolence would come in the form of reparations to the tune of billions and billions of dollars restored to the Haitian people for the historical wrongs that have been visited upon them by successive U.S. administrations, both Democrat and Republican.
Mm-hmm. Now, Keaton, we also have the UN Human Rights Office expressing disappointment that there have apparently not been any individual assessments of the cases of the migrants by the United States. Why shouldn't that happen?
Well, the U.S. has been guilty of human rights violations since the American War for Independence in 1776, be it persecution and military removal and extinction of Native American tribes here in the U.S., or during World War II, the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, or, of course, Jim Crow era and slavery. The U.S. has a long-standing history, the United States government has a long-standing history of human rights abuses. And then the U.S. will take this, however, and then make international claims that, no, China is the enemy. China is abusing human rights. Iran is abusing human rights. Cuba, Venezuela, Haiti, the list goes on and on. At this point, it seems that human rights, or the concept of human rights, has simply become a political bargaining tool for those in power, for the most powerful in the UN, Britain and the United States. So to toy with this idea that the U.S. will rightfully and thoroughly address human rights allegations, to me seems like nonsense. It would be very out of character for the U.S. state apparatus.
Mm-hmm. Danny, let's look at it from a different angle. Isn't it thanks to Washington's own policies and meddling in some countries' affairs that forces some people to leave their countries and look for better lives elsewhere, like in the U.S.? I mean, isn't it the case of chickens coming home to roost?
That's exactly correct, and not just some people, but millions and millions, if not billions. How many Libyans, how many Syrians, how many Afghans have died making the perilous trek across the Mediterranean, across Asia and in Europe, trying to find a better way. So people are going to follow capital. People historically are going to follow the very resources usurped from them. It really comes at no surprise. And this is going to continue to happen. The right-wing media blitz right now, they continue to call this Biden's border crisis, as though Biden somehow created all of this. This goes way deeper than any individual politician. This goes hemisphere and centuries deep. So it begs a much more critical perspective on U.S. foreign policy. And until there's a fundamental change in the relationship between U.S. hegemony and U.S. unipolarity in the world's people, nothing will change. And how hypocritical Biden was at the UN just a few hours ago talking about there's no new Cold War, we'll work with anybody. but look at the unfettered aggression against China, against Russia, against Vietnam, against Pyongyang, against any country who dares to defy U.S. unipolarity.
Keaton, let's have your opinion on the same question.
Well, I was always introduced to this topic through the analogy that when someone pulls a gun, when someone has a firearm, the safest place to be is behind the person holding the gun. And I think that translates pretty well into immigration into the United States. When U.S. and NATO toppled Gaddafi's Libya, thousands and thousands of Libyans flee to the United States, flee to France, flee to the West, because, quite frankly, the U.S. is the only country that the U.S. cannot orchestrate a regime change in. And so people are trying to go to the safest place, which ultimately ends up being going to the aggressor, going to the oppressor historically and currently. And so the U.S.'s attempt to, as Danny said, that constantly pushing this aggression against China, who's attempting to build infrastructure and build hospitals and schools and put capital, put money to good use. The U.S. doesn't want that. And so any sort of pro-China, or more specifically, any sort of anti-American government is going to be an enemy of the U.S. State Department, of the intelligence agencies, and in turn has got to go. It's got to be destroyed. It doesn't matter the cost of human lives. Iraq, Saddam had to go no matter the cost. And so it's a historical thing. It's not even a phenomenon at this point. It is just a consistent foreign policy of the U.S. to take out anybody they don't like, no matter what the cost is.
Right. Danny, I got one last question for you, and I want Keaton also to comment on that. And that's if you can think of any solution to this migrant problem in the United States.
Oh, we can definitely think of a solution. That solution is called socialism. That solution is called reparations. That solution is called fight back, the unity of all oppressed people. Until there's a people's government here, from D.C. to Miami to Los Angeles, nothing's going to change. This system, capitalism, is based on the pillaging of people's resources across the world. That's why they've gone after Syria so savagely. Look at these cruel sanctions imposed upon Tehran and upon Caracas and Havana, and now you have further aggression against Nicaragua. And I think it's time for the American people to connect the dots, that who is the aggression meted out against? Any system that does not conform with U.S. hegemony, immediately they are under the boot and under the gun of U.S. militarism.
Okay, Keaton, what's the solution to the immigrant problem?
I absolutely think there is a solution.